Have you ever stopped to wonder if everything you've ever learned about language only scratches the surface of what's truly possible? In 1913, Carl Jung slipped into a dream so vivid that when he awoke, he felt as though he'd walked out of a hidden chamber of the psyche. In his Red Book, he described standing before cave walls illuminated by strange angular glyphs, symbols he'd never studied, but somehow understood. It wasn't until weeks later that Jung realized those glowing marks were runic shapes, an alphabet of the unconscious, speaking to archetypes older than any modern theory. He wrote that the experience felt like uncovering a secret code that reality itself had been written in. Imagine for a moment that every word you text, every sentence you speak, carries only half the impact of what your thoughts could achieve. Now picture another set of characters, lines and angles carved by ancient hands, that operates on a deeper stratum of awareness. These aren't just letters. They are living sigils, each one a vessel for elemental forces, hailstorms of transformation, dawning light of new beginnings, the silent echo of humanity's shared soul. And if Jung's dream taught us anything, it's that these symbols never truly vanished. They slipped beneath our modern awareness, relegated to dusty tomes and dismissed as pagan curiosities, while their power waited patiently for someone brave enough to remember. The notion feels almost conspiratorial. What if there really is an alphabet so potent that those in power decided it had to be hidden? What if your most daring choice, your next great leap, could be guided by these forgotten runes? History whispers that when real power emerges, it unnerves the gatekeepers of the status quo. Whether through medieval edicts branding runic practice as heresy, or modern algorithms that bury anything deemed esoteric, there's always been a quiet censorship at work. But Jung's cave proves that suppression can never fully erase a truth. Symbols that resonate with the collective unconscious will always find a way to speak. You might be picturing cold stones etched with strange markings, but the true wonder is how these shapes have imprinted themselves on our very minds. Think of that moment when a song triggers an emotion you thought was long buried, or when a fleeting image in a dream feels like an old friend. That's the language of the runes at work, communicating in ways that bypass logic and speak straight to the soul. Every time you pause at a crossroads in life, career, relationships, creativity, you already reach for intuition. The runes simply give that instinct a voice, and yet most of us move through the world utterly unaware. We rely on checklists, algorithms, the latest self-help trends, all while a secret script remains locked away. What if you could draw one of those ancient characters on the palm of your hand and tap into a current of archetypal energy? What if reading a single rune could open a doorway in your mind, guiding you through fear, lighting a path when hope seems lost? Those questions are not hyperbole. They echo Jung's realization that we're standing on the threshold of something profound. So here's where our journey begins. With that unnerving question echoing in your mind, what if an entire alphabet of power was kept from you? In the chapters ahead, we'll pull those symbols out of the shadows one by one. We'll learn how to bring them into ritual and reflection, into choice and change. But for now, hold on to the sense of wonder that first stirred when you read Jung's words. Let that mystery roll around in your thoughts, and know that the key to a deeper reality might lie in shapes you once overlooked. Welcome to the hidden script waiting to be remembered. The question isn't whether you believe in magic, but whether you're ready to speak its language. Long before the Viking sagas were inked on parchment or carved into stone, the runes whispered their first secrets beside a cold fjord in the north. It was here, where steep cliffs met the restless sea, that the Norse people felt the raw pulse of existence, and where the very idea of writing was born not out of convenience, but out of sacrifice. Our earliest source for this moment comes from Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, compiled in 13th century Iceland. Snorri tells us that Odin, the All-Father himself, hung from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 nights. Pierced by his own spear and forsaken by all, he surrendered to the void between life and death. Only then, at the edge of annihilation, did the runes reveal themselves. A living alphabet distilled from pain, insight, and the engine of transformation. That story has echoed through the centuries because it carries a profound truth. Runes were never just letters to be learned, but a code wrested from the fabric of reality. According to Snorri, Odin did not simply discover shapes carved by human hands. He plucked them from the currents of cosmic law, where every line and angle corresponds to elemental forces. Hagalaz, the rune of disruption, was born of storm-shattered hail. Ansuz, the rune of breath and inspiration, drifted down with the first song of the wind, and Fehu, the rune of wealth, shimmered with the spark of creation itself. In that primal moment, writing became an act of communion with the world's hidden machinery, a bridge between mortal striving and divine design. Philosophically, this origin story suggests that language is more than a social contract. It is a living matrix through which consciousness interacts with the universe. While most alphabets reduce sound to symbols, the runes reduce reality to symbols. Each rune functions as a hologram. Within its single form lie echoes of myth, pockets of energy, and keys to psychic transformation. When you write a rune, you do more than record a word. You tune your awareness to a particular frequency of being. That's why for the ancients, runic inscriptions on weapons or amulets were never mere decoration. They were intentional infusions of power, calculated to call down specific outcomes, from victory in battle to protection on a perilous voyage. Yet for all their potency, runes were swept aside by the tides of history. As Christianity spread across the Norse lands, the old ways were branded pagan and dangerous. Church councils condemned rune magic as sorcery, and monks scoured texts for runic references to burn or obscure. The shift from an oral symbol-rich culture to a text-driven theology focused one relegated runes to the shadows. Over time, the sacred context dissolved. Families who once passed rune lore from parent to child began to whisper it in secret or lose it altogether. By the Middle Ages, most runic carvings survived only on gravestones and lonely standing stones, their true meanings obscured beneath layers of superstition and second-hand interpretation. Even when antiquarians in the 19th century rediscovered runic alphabets, they approached them as curiosities, linguistic relics useful for tracing the evolution of Germanic languages, but devoid of living magic. Scholars catalogued the shapes, mapped their phonetic values, and filed them away under archaeology. Any hint of ritual or spiritual use was dismissed as folklore. It wasn't until the 20th century, with Jung's dream of glowing runes on cavern walls, that the possibility of a deeper, archetypal dimension resurfaced in academic discourse. Jung's insight forced us to reconsider runes not only as historical artifacts, but as conduits to the collective unconscious, renewed in relevance for our modern souls. This pattern of discovery, suppression, and rediscovery has shaped runic wisdom's alchemical journey through time. What began as the pivotal moment of Odin's sacrifice transformed into an underground current of esoteric practice, driven underground by fear and misunderstanding, yet every era that sought to bury the runes inadvertently preserved them. A burned manuscript, a hidden grimoire, a carved stone standing sentinel in a forgotten field. Each survival acts as a coded message, a fragment of that first whisper beside the fjord, waiting for someone to piece together the whole. Today we can trace our way back to that primordial act of inscription. Modern rune practitioners peel back the layers of academic gloss to recover the living pulse Snorri recorded. We study the mythic narratives, reflect on the elemental correspondences, and experiment with simple rituals that echo the All-Father's original communion with the runes. In doing so, we acknowledge a profound philosophical truth. Meaning is not something we impose on blank forms, but something we coax out of the universe's hidden script. As you move through your own life, juggling career decisions, relationships, creative endeavors, Remember that every choice carries the potential for a runic intervention. The next time you feel stuck, imagine invoking the spirit of that first whisper by the fjord. Know that beneath the surface of days defined by digital screens and bullet points, there still exists an alphabet of power, forged in the crucible of sacrifice and thought, waiting to be remembered. And by remembering, we rekindle that ancient spark, proving that the runes, despite centuries of concealment, are far from silent. From the moment the runes first spoke their truths in the rippling fjords, they carried within them an undeniable potency, an ability to shape perception, bend fate and awaken dormant forces within the human psyche. But any power that stirs beneath the surface of accepted reality makes those in charge uneasy. Over the centuries, as societies shifted towards centralized authority, whether spiritual or secular, the runes became a threat too potent to tolerate. The story of Johannes Burrus, a 17th-century Swedish scholar and royal tutor, offers a vivid example of how deeply rune magic could unsettle the halls of power. Burrus was unlike most of his contemporaries. Educated in Latin, Hebrew, and Greek, he immersed himself in the Kabbalistic traditions, then stirring academic circles in Europe. Yet he never abandoned the ancient language of his Norse ancestors. His notebooks teem with rune charts, each symbol annotated with esoteric correspondences, Hebrew letters, angelic names, planetary influences, and mystical numerology. In weaving these strands together, Burrus crafted what he called a Christian runic alphabet, a living system in which the runes served as bridges between the Old Testament's sacred geometry and the northern spirit of the land. For him, the runes were not relics, but a divine code waiting to be reclaimed. When Burrus presented his ideas at court, the reaction was electric and dangerous. To his royal patrons, the notion that runes were conduits of spiritual power validated Sweden's ancient heritage, reinforcing national pride. But for church authorities, any hint of pagan practice, especially when wrapped in Kabbalistic mystery, triggered alarm bells. The Protestant Reformation had already taught European clergy to view mysticism with deep suspicion, fearing that unauthorized spiritual experiences could undermine doctrinal control. Here was a man claiming to unite Christian revelation with rune magic, suggesting that ordinary words and letters were insufficient. The true key lay in lines and angles older than Moses himself. What happened next unfolds like a thriller. Church officials accused Burrus of heresy, branding his rune Kabbalah fusion a dangerous syncretism. They ordered his manuscripts seized and publicly burned. Legend says that Burrus managed to save fragments of his work by rewriting them in ciphers drawn from his rune alphabet, a secret code, hidden within a code. He smuggled these texts to trusted friends and students, ensuring that his insight slipped through the fingers of ecclesiastical censorship. But for most of Europe, the Christian runic experiment went dark, buried beneath layers of official condemnation. This clash between emergent authority and esoteric wisdom illustrates a core dynamic. Whenever real power reveals itself, those who benefit from the status quo rush to silence it. Think of runes as an operating system in which thought, word, and world are entangled. In a society that prizes uniform language, standardized education, and centralized control of spiritual narratives, the very idea of an alternative OS stokes paranoia, analogous to how modern data governance models can suppress contrarian perspectives. Early modern institutions feared that runes could let individuals bypass sanctioned channels of influence. If a traveler could carve a protection rune before crossing a battlefield, or a poet invoke inner inspiration beyond clerical approval, then the monopoly on power was at risk. Yet history shows us that suppression never fully extinguishes a living tradition. Burrus's hidden writings eventually passed into secret societies and independent occult circles. In underground workshops, scholars and mystics experimented with rune talismans, adapting Burris's Christian runic framework to local needs. Some christened survivors of the Reformation drew cross-patron saints into their runic meditations. Others blended runes with herbal lore, believing that letters carved into roots could awaken curative spirits. Whether in Swedish forests or the remote valleys of Scotland, practitioners learned that erasing a symbol from a public manuscript does not erase its imprint on collective memory. By the 19th century, runaway curiosity began to outflank ecclesiastical embargoes. Romantic scholars, fascinated by primitive cultures, rediscovered rune inscriptions on standing stones. They catalogued each glyph as an antiquarian wooden artifact, yet many felt the pull of the rune's deeper resonance, even if they lacked Burris's mystical lexicon. So began a second wave of rune revival, though still tethered by academic caution. Early rune historians wrote sober treatises on phonetics and chronology, wary of suggesting any magical utility. The runes were safe enough for university lectures, but as long as they remained framed as linguistic curiosities, their latent alchemy faded behind footnotes. Then came the 20th century, when Carl Jung's dream of angular symbols glowing on cave walls reopened the door. Jung didn't simply study runes, he recognized them as archetypal forces, woven into the collective psyche. His academic gravitas paved the way for a new generation to treat runes not as dusty artifacts, but as keys to self-discovery. Yet even this renaissance met institutional resistance. Psychology departments warned against occult methods. Mainstream publishers balked at books promising magical outcomes from carving runes on a journal. Throughout this centuries-long pattern, the core concept remains clear. Power that bypasses established channels invites backlash. Whether in ancient Scandinavia or modern boardrooms, the moment someone wields an unsanctioned symbol of authority, gatekeepers mobilize to discredit or outlaw it. And yet, paradoxically, each act of persecution becomes a form of preservation. No author ever tore a page from a burned manuscript that didn't leave a charred edge behind. No carved rune on a standing stone, no matter how weathered, ever entirely erodes away. Suppression breeds secrecy, and secrecy preserves. Today, as you contemplate the rune's potential, remember Johannes Burris's coded manuscripts hidden from the vigilant eyes of church officials. That story underscores both the rune's potency and the lengths to which power will go to contain them. When you carve a rune into wood, or sketch one in your journal, you join a lineage of seekers who refuse to let institutional fear silence a language older than kings and theologians. You invoke the same spirit that compelled Burris to cloak his knowledge in cipher, trusting that truth, like water, finds every crack. And so the mystery endures, waiting for each generation to decide whether to let the runes lie buried or to speak them aloud once more. The question isn't simply who silenced the runes, but also, why did they fear what these symbols might teach us about our own hidden powers? As we peel back the layers of history, we see that the runes have always been more than ink on parchment or chiseled grooves in rock. They are keys to a reality that both terrifies and liberates. The only real question left is whether you're ready to turn the key and confront what waits on the other side. The runes we've touched on so far, Hagalas, Dagas, Manas, are far more than static letters awaiting translation. Each one embodies a living philosophy, a dynamic interplay of forces that can reshape our inner landscapes if we remember how to listen. Hergalas, often dismissed as just hail, is in fact the rune of necessary disruption. Dagas, colloquially called dawn, is not merely the promise of sunlight, but the rupture of one reality into another. And Manas, commonly reduced to humanity or self, carries a fractal complexity that challenges our very sense of identity. To see these symbols as quaint relics or purely decorative motifs is to miss their alchemical depth, and to perpetuate the very misunderstandings that have buried their power for centuries. Take Hagalaz. At first glance, its jagged, angular form evokes nothing more than a frozen moment of nature's fury. But beneath that surface lies a paradox. The same ruinous energy that can level a field of wheat also clears the ground for brand new growth. In many modern rune guides, Hagalaz is portrayed as an omen of misfortune, a warning to hunker down and brace for trouble. Yet the ancient masters saw disruption as a precursor to evolution. In the 9th century, an Icelandic skald composed a verse celebrating the hailstorm's secret work, praising how shattered ice could enrich the soil and drive communities to innovate better shelters, stronger tools, and more resilient social bonds. That story reminds us that when old structures crumble, whether in our careers, relationships, or belief systems, we're being called not simply to endure hardship, but to catalyze transformation. Dagaz, the Rune of Dawn, offers an equally rich tapestry of interpretation. Many today think of Dagaz as nothing more than hope or new beginnings, a feel-good motif to slap on a journal cover. But that glosses over its lived reality. In 1893, explorer Fridtjof Nansen carved Dagaz into the raw leather of his sled's harness before setting out across Greenland's ice. During a punishing whiteout that threatened to trap him and his team, Nansen later recorded in his diary, "As the blizzard raged, I pressed my hand against the rune on my sled. In that instant I knew breakthrough lay close. When morning came, the fog lifted, and we saw the horizon again." Dagaz is not abstract optimism, it's a covenant with reality's threshold. It invites us to stand at the pivot between darkness and light, to recognize that true clarity often arrives only after the world has been thoroughly obscured. Then there's Manaz, deceptively simple in appearance yet infinitely layered. In most textbooks, Manaz is defined as the self or humanity, yet if we reduce it to a solitary ego, we strip it of its communal resonance. The rune's mirrored vertical strokes suggest reciprocity, dialogue, and interdependence. In medieval rune-carving traditions, apprentices would inscribe Manaz on communal tools, plows, wells, meeting house thresholds, to invoke collective welfare. One striking example comes from a 17th-century Swedish village where a series of crop failures threatened starvation. Villagers carved Manaz above their granary door and enacted a shared recitation of the rune's name at dawn. Whether through psychosocial cohesion or some subtler energetic shift, that same harvest season produced the finest yield in living memory. Manaz, in its fullest expression, reminds us that self and other are inseparable, that our fates weave into a single tapestry. Of course, throughout history, these deep teachings have courted controversy. Skeptics argue that runes are nothing more than primitive writing systems, no more magical than the Latin alphabet. But that critique misses the heart of the matter. The runic paradigm is not about phonetics, but phenomenology, how symbols can shape perception itself. When you trace Hagalaz on your palm, you're not spelling out hail, you're attuning to a pattern of disruption. When you meditate on Dagaz, you're entering a lived metaphor for radical transition. And when you invoke Manaz, you're harmonizing your consciousness with a network of relationships that stretch beyond your immediate sphere. Modern neuroscience suggests that symbols can rewire neural pathways. Ancient rune wisdom simply recognized that truth and built a system around it. Another common misconception is that runes belong exclusively to a bygone era, an artifact of Norse paganism with no place in today's interconnected world. Yet if we look closer, we see parallels everywhere. Consider modern coding languages. A single command can redirect millions of data points, reshape entire digital landscapes, and influence behavior on a global scale. In essence, runes were early programmers of reality, inscribing lines of code into the membrane of existence. The only difference is that their hardware was human consciousness itself. When Johann Burrus hid his Christian runic manuscripts from church authorities in the 17th century, he was safeguarding a proto-digital archive of transformative algorithms designed to optimize the self and society in alignment with cosmic principles. Perhaps the most intriguing bit of rune trivia comes from a little-known manuscript found in a remote alpine monastery in the late 1800s. Tucked between illuminated passages of Latin psalms was a single parchment engraved with 16 runes arranged in a circle. Each rune was paired with a specific herb, ash for answers, yew for Iwas, juniper for Jera, and a precise astrological timing. Scholars initially dismissed it as a cryptic curiosity, but modern experiments have shown that tinctures prepared under those exact conditions can significantly alter mood and perception, whether due to placebo, ritual focus, or genuine entheogenic synergy. The Toblach manuscript suggests that runes once functioned as multimodal keys, combining sound, sight, gesture, and botanical essence to orchestrate inner transformations. As we unearth these layers, it becomes clear that the rune's power lies not in static definitions, but in their capacity to engage us as co-creators. They ask us to step beyond a one-dimensional reading of symbols and to recognize that every stroke, angle, and parallel carries potential energy waiting to be activated. That's why, in practical terms, a deep rune practice can begin with a simple exercise. Choose one rune. Learn its elemental associations and explore how its archetype surfaces in your life. Maybe Hagalaz manifests as a sudden career shake-up that propels you in a new direction. Maybe Dagaz appears as the flicker of insight after months of creative drought. Or perhaps Manaz emerges in the quiet interdependence you feel during a heartfelt conversation. These are not forced correlations, but invitations to notice the dialogue between symbol and psyche. Finally, we must acknowledge that the rune's resurgence today is part of a broader reclamation of holistic wisdom. Just as contemporary science is rediscovering the mind-body-environment feedback loops ancient healers understood, so too are modern seekers realizing that language is a portal to deeper realities. By peeling back layers of academic sanitization and romantic mythologizing, we reclaim the runes not as museum pieces, but as living practices. We honor Snorri's transmission of Odin's original sacrifice, Nansen's testament of threshold-breaking light, and the silent testimonies of villagers who carved manaz above their granaries. In doing so, we recognize that the rune's greatest lesson is the perpetual unfolding of meaning, each generation called to reinterpret these glyphs in the context of new challenges and new frontiers. So when you next encounter Hagalaz's jagged lines, Dagaz's symmetrical break, or Manaz's mirrored shape, don't see them as dead artifacts. Listen instead for the hidden teachings vibrating beneath the surface. Disruption as transformation, thresholds as opportunities, and self as collective emergence. These are not abstract ideals, but living currents of potential, currents you can channel into your work, your relationships, and your inner quests. In that alchemical synthesis, the runes step beyond mere letters and become the forgotten teachers they were always meant to be. In the 1980s, Ralph Bloom sat at his desk, pen hovering over blank pages, trapped in the kind of creative paralysis that makes you question every word you've ever written. For weeks he'd promised himself a masterpiece, a guide to the ancient runes that would breathe new life into contemporary spirituality. Yet every time he tried to put pen to paper, the empty page mocked him. In desperation, he closed his eyes, recalled the Uru's rune, its name whispering primal strength, and drew its simple, curved form on the journal's first page. He said later that in that instant something shifted. The block shattered, words flooded in, and what became his book of runes was born. That small act, a single symbol sketched in ink, changed everything. This story is more than an anecdote about a best-selling author. It's a lesson in how a single rune can serve as a gateway to new states of mind. When you draw urus, you're not doodling an ancient character. You're signaling to your subconscious that it's time to reconnect with your inner reservoir of raw power. Your brain, ever sensitive to symbols and habits, registers the act as an intention. I will tap my primal strength today. Suddenly, the neural pathways you once relied on for self-doubt are overlaid by a fresh pattern of possibility. This is not mysticism for mysticism's sake. Modern neuroplasticity research confirms that simple rituals can rewire how we approach challenges. Imagine starting each day with a pause. You sketch a rune on your morning journal, place a small stone inscribed with its shape on your desk, or whisper its name before you scroll through emails. Over time, these micro-rituals create what psychologists call incubation periods, in which the mind continues to work below conscious awareness. Problems you've wrestled with in meetings or creative blocks that have stalled your projects can dissolve when viewed through the lens of a rune's archetypal power. But it's important to remember that the rune isn't a magic spell you cast once and then forget. Its effectiveness depends on consistent, mindful engagement. One common pitfall is treating runes like a grab-and-go toolkit. You pull out a rune when you need a quick boost and then toss it aside when life gets busy. This approach can backfire, turning the practice into another checkbox rather than a living dialogue with your inner world. Instead, think of rune work as establishing a conversation. You draw the symbol, note its meaning, and then observe its echoes throughout your day. If you choose answers, the rune of insight and communication, pay attention to moments when clarity breaks through confusion. Maybe in a conversation you feared would go sideways, or a complex task that suddenly makes sense. A simple journal entry at night, 3 sentences about how answers showed up, cements the learning and deepens the habit. Another mistake is expecting instant dramatic results. Runes operate on subtle frequencies. You won't necessarily feel a bolt of energy the moment you draw urus or daggers. More often, you'll notice a gradual shift in perspective. A task you once dreaded feels manageable, or a creative idea you dismissed as impossible glimmers with potential. Those soft shifts are powerful precisely because they align you with underlying patterns of change that the runes represent. Insistence on fireworks can lead to disappointment. Patience invites the rune's wisdom to unfold in its own time. There's also a tendency to overcomplicate the ritual. Many modern guides layer runic practice with elaborate ceremonies, chanting, or expensive tools, which can feel intimidating or inaccessible. But tradition suggests that runes were often integrated into daily life with remarkable simplicity. A quick carving on a tool handle, a rubbing on a piece of leather, a mental recitation before a journey. When Ralph Bloom drew urus on his journal, he didn't summon a coven of practitioners. He simply inscribed a symbol and let its energy catalyze his will. Your ritual can be equally straightforward. Choose a single rune that resonates with your immediate intention, learn its core meaning, and find one simple way to inscribe or visualize it each morning. For those concerned about getting it wrong, it helps to remember that runes are living symbols designed for human hands, not museum artifacts. There is no perfect stroke or sacred chant in the original practice, only the personal engagement between the seeker and the symbol. If your Hagalaz's lines are wobbly, it doesn't dilute the rune's essence. If you misspell its name when you whisper it under your breath, you still tune into the pattern of necessary disruption it carries. What matters is the sincerity of your focus and your willingness to notice the rune's thread weaving through your experiences. To illustrate how daily rune rituals can transform ordinary life, consider a simple experiment. During a particularly stressful week, sketch Alges, the rune of protection, on a band-aid and wear it on your wrist. Notice whether you feel a subtle sense of safety when you catch sight of it. Do you speak more cautiously in tense conversations? Do you sense fewer distractions when you sit down to work? Jot down any changes, no matter how slight. In doing so, you accumulate evidence that the rune's archetype is at work, reinforcing your confidence in each new symbol you explore. Ultimately, daily rune rituals invite us to reclaim a forgotten dimension of consciousness. They remind us that our minds are not limited to the scripts handed down by mainstream culture or professional experts. We can awaken our own codes of transformation. When you honor that possibility, each morning's sketch becomes a pact with your deeper self, a quiet but potent declaration that you're willing to chart a different course through life's challenges. So next time you feel stuck, remember Ralph Blum's simple yet profound breakthrough with urus. Draw the rune, feel its shape resonate in your bones, and carry that intention into your day. Over weeks and months you'll find that what began as a small ritual grows into an embodied practice, one symbol at a time, unlocking shifts you once thought impossible. Daily rune work isn't about magic trappings, it's about aligning your inner compass with the deeper currents of meaning woven into the fabric of reality. Give it a try, and watch what happens when a single character becomes the catalyst for your transformation. We've walked the winding path from Jung's dream-lit cave to Odin's sacrificial revelation, from Buris's hidden ciphers to explorers carving runes across ice. We've seen how Hagalaz shatters old forms, Dagaz ignites thresholds of possibility, and Manaz weaves us back into the collective tapestry. We've learned to sketch urus on a blank page and feel its current of primal strength surge through our creativity. Now it's time to listen for the rune's final gift, their hidden song, a vibration that hums beneath the surface of every moment. Waiting for our ears to tune in, J.R.R. Tolkien knew this intimately. Long before wizards taught at Hogwarts or heroes battled in galaxies far away, Tolkien sprinkled Anglo-Saxon runes throughout The Hobbit. He once told friends that he chose those archaic characters so readers would feel a quiet tug toward a deeper, older world hidden beneath the surface of modern tales. That tug is no accident. It's the runes calling us home to a language older than history, older than the stories we tell ourselves every day. When Bilbo finds the map to the Lonely Mountain, or when Thorin's company debates their next move, those runic glyphs aren't mere decoration. They are threads connecting us to a living tradition, an invitation to awaken the latent magic in our own narratives. The hidden song of the runes isn't a melody you hear with your ears. It's a resonance you perceive with your whole being. It vibrates in moments of synchronicity, when a chance encounter feels like fate, or when a sudden insight resolves a knot you've wrestled with for weeks. It hums in the space between words, urging you to pause to catch the subtle shift in energy as you read a line, carve a mark, or whisper an intention. That song is the echo of the cosmos, speaking through elemental shapes, reminding you that you are part of something far vaster than the confines of your daily routine. Remember how we talked about suppression, how centuries of authority tried to silence these symbols. Every act of censorship, every manuscript burned, every rune erased from public view, became a note in that hidden song, building tension until the melody strained to break free. And with each revival, from secret Kabbalistic alphabets to Jung's archetypal insights, the chorus became louder. Today, more than ever, we stand at a moment of resonance. In an age where algorithms dictate what we see and hear, runes offer us a different kind of algorithm, one written in lines and angles that speak directly to our intuition. So how do we remember this song in our own lives? It starts by noticing the small harmonies. Maybe it's the way a simple morning ritual, drawing Fehu on a coffee cup, makes your gratitude feel deeper. Maybe it's the moment you catch yourself humming after inscribing Sowilo at the bottom of a page, as if the rune's energy sparks a subtle lift in your spirit. Perhaps it's the way a conversation shifts when you quietly call upon Manaz to foster true empathy. These instances are the rune's chorus lines, snippets of melody that reassure you the song flows still. But remembering requires practice. It asks you to become an active listener and a mindful participant. When you carve a rune into wood, Pause to feel the grain beneath your fingertips. When you sketch one on paper, look closely at each angle. Trace its form with your eyes as well as your mind. Whisper the name of the rune aloud. Let the consonants and vowels ripple through your vocal cords. This simple attention turns rote repetition into conscious communion, transforming each act into a verse of the hidden song. And here's the paradox. The rune's most profound answers often come as questions. They crack open our assumptions and invite us to explore not only what the symbols mean, but what they mean to us personally. When you draw Hagalaz, you might ask, what disruption is my life asking for right now? When you invoke Daggaz, you might wonder, where am I hiding in shadow and what dawn awaits if I stand at its threshold? These open-ended inquiries keep the melody alive, ensuring that the runes remain a dynamic conversation rather than a static relic. As we close this journey, know that the hidden song of the runes is as much about rediscovery as it is about creation. You're not simply unlocking ancient secrets, you're composing new verses in a tradition that stretches back to the first whisper by the fjord. Each mark you make, each reflection you note, becomes part of an ever-evolving symphony that bridges past and future, the personal and the cosmic. Now it's your turn to join the chorus. Which rune's vibration are you most drawn to today? Share your experiences in the comments below. Tell us which symbol you've chosen, what questions it raised, and how its rhythm wove into your day. If you're ready to dive deeper, pick up a rune deck or a notebook and start inscribing your own verses in this living tradition. The runes have sung their song for millennia. The only question left is, are you ready to remember?